Oggi parliamo di economia ed in particolare di due aspetti molto interessanti come la ricerca empirica in ambito economico ed il salario minimo. E lo facciamo con il premio Nobel 2021 per l'economia, il professor David Card. Professor Card, how does it feel to be a Nobel Prize winner?
It's not such a big change, to tell you the truth. More interviews, but I'm still teaching my classes and struggling to write some papers. So not so different, no.
Many people think that a Nobel Prize winner is some kind of superhero with superpowers.
Well, I haven't heard about that, but yeah, no. I think it's nice to get an award like that, but it doesn't really. I don't think it makes too big an immediate difference. Yeah.
How did your attraction to the economy come about? When did you decide to become an economist?
Well, originally in college, I was taking physics. And my girlfriend at the time was taking an economics class, and she was using this textbook by Richard Lipsey, a famous British economist who had moved to Canada. And so she was having some trouble with one of the formulas and asked me to look at it. And I did that, and I started reading the chapter associated with that one particular formula. And I thought it was actually very good. It was describing agricultural markets, and I grew up on a farm. And to tell you the truth, for whatever reason, I never really knew about how to think about demand and supply in agricultural markets. People sort of say things like, well, it's all demand and supply, but it's not very meaningful what usually they mean. But anyway, I found the chapter quite insightful. So I decided, well, maybe I should take an economics class, and I found it pretty interesting. And luckily for me, I don't think I would have been such a great.
How would you describe the relationship between theory and empirics in economics?
Well, the historical relationship was, the theory was sort of well-established framework that was pretty much accepted as more or less correct. And the goal of the empirical work was to identify values of particular, parameters or variables in those models to sort of say, well, is one effect that this theory identifies bigger than the other, or which of the two is larger? But the goal, the overarching framework was established by the theoretical models, and the goal of the empirical work was to essentially quantify some of the different aspects of those models. And that was really reflective, I think, of this long tradition in economics of economists developing pretty elaborate models of the way the world worked, and feeling very comfortable that they knew what they were talking about. It's strange in a way, because that all kind of fell apart during the Great Depression in the 1930s. There was a lot of rethinking about how to do economics and so on. But fundamentally, not that many real things had changed. But then what happened, I think, starting in the 70s and 80s, it became possible to do much more serious empirical work, really, to tell you the truth. So data became available, things like the surveys that they conduct every month to analyze unemployment rates, or income statistics that are collected to measure poverty, and those kind of things. Those became available. Important source of new information that hadn't really been able to use very well. And then at the same time, there was a lot of computer power suddenly available, these big, huge mainframe computers. And so people started to take it a little bit more seriously, and there was a bunch of people collecting new kinds of data, like information about how people's families evolved over time. I guess there's a very famous one that the Bank of Italy constructs called the Sheave, that was probably started in the early 1980s, I suspect. Anyway, so that kind of information became available, and people started to investigate the data without necessarily having all the theory in front of them, sort of saying, okay, what's really in the data? And it became more and more clear that we needed to have better theories.
The findings in myth and measurement clearly influenced the empirical approaches adopted in subsequent research on minimum wages, but not only on minimum wages. Can we say that thanks also to your work, today there's less attention to theory and more attention to data and experience?
Well, I may have made some small contribution there. I think there was lots of other people who also deserve quite a bit of credit for that change. You know, in all honesty, my thesis advisor was also the advisor of Josh Angrist, who was co-winner, and many other people, you know, starting in the late 1970s and early 1980s, started to do more empirical work, and started to think a little bit more broadly about how we could use some of the very simple methods that are used in other sciences to better understand what's going on in economics. So I think there's been some change, yeah, for sure.
What will be the trend in the coming years? Will we have more and more empirical approach?
Well, I think there's multiple trends, and they don't all sort of go in the same direction. So there's one trend which is pretty important, I think, which is trying to do randomized experiments, randomized trials, and that's pretty important in areas like education, where there's a lot of that kind of work going on. In certain areas of government policy, like I was involved in the 1990s in actually an experiment to evaluate an alternative welfare system in Canada. And it's pretty widely used in a lot of areas of development economics where people are trying to introduce, one of my colleagues, for instance, did a long-term study where they made available deworming medicines in some villages in Kenya and not in others. And they've been following those the children of those villagers and their children for almost 20 years now. And so that's kind of set up a research program there. So that's one thrust. Another thrust, though, is almost in the opposite direction. At the same time as there's been a lot more new data, there's a lot of economists developing extremely elaborate models of things. And for instance, there's very elaborate models of international trade, how firms are involved in trade. And there's starting to be some interest in seeing whether some of those models could be estimated with firm level data, and trying to understand, if we have a trade war with China, what actually happens to the workers in the different industries and so on, really at the ground level rather than from a theoretical perspective. So there is at the same time as there's this new, thrust of making things very simple and trying to do everything very, very based on simple scientific ideas like experiments. There is another school of research going in the opposite direction.
What are the fundamental elements of a good empirical analysis?
In my view, this is my view. I'm not sure that everyone agrees with this, but in my view, there has to be an important question, or that the empirical analysis is directed toward. It's very easy when you start an empirical analysis to get lost. I see thousands of students every year working on things, and they're not quite sure of what they're trying to do. They don't have a really good question in mind. And in economics, especially, if you don't have a very sharp idea about what you're looking for, it's easy to get lost. So you need a really sharp idea. Then you need to have translated that idea into something that's pretty easily detected in the kind of data that you have. So if you say, I want to study the effect of the minimum wage and whether it increases employment, but the only data you have is, data at the province level for, overall employment across Italian provinces, that's hopeless. It's just not going to work, because, if the minimum wage has an effect, it only affects 10% of the employees. And it's probably not that big an effect. So we know right away that we can't detect it. And I think people in my side of economics have so much experience in knowing that, okay, this kind of an exercise isn't going to work. So there's no point in trying to kill yourself and look for something that you're just not going to be able to find. And it leads to bad science too, because people, they've committed so much time to doing something and they don't find it, that they kind of fiddle around sometimes, or there's a concern that they're fiddling around. Let's put it that way. Anyway, so then the third thing you need to have is related to that is this, the best possible data with as much information. And then the fourth thing is you have to have really carefully presented the information from the data to readers and other analysts, so they can kind of see that that the idea that you think you're finding seems to really be there. So you need to think of a transparent, credible way to show the idea that, or question that you're trying to investigate, really is important, and it really is manifested in the data. And if you can get all that together, then usually you can have an impactful paper.
Your research into the effects of the minimum wage increase, much of which was compiled in your book with Alan Kruger, has generated considerable controversy. Can you tell us about it?
Well, first of all, my work was a long time ago. It was almost 30 years ago that work was done. And at the time, especially, say, in the 1970s and 60s, there had been a really sort of strong effort by one school of thought in economics to say the labor market behaves very competitively, and the kind of model that you would use to study stock prices, prices on the stock exchange, or study commodity prices like prices of wheat and things like that. Those same models were perfectly adequate and useful for studying the labor market. And there had been attempts to, as I mentioned before, in the Great Depression, for instance, it seemed like the labor market was really falling apart and those models weren't working very well. And there had been attempts to try and move away from those models, but they hadn't really been successful and been kind of pushed back all through the 40s and 50s and 60s. But as the new data became available, I think people started to realize that there was a lot of things going on, and so the main thing that I was interested in, and my colleague at the time, now passed away, Alan Kruger, were interested in, was the idea that wages are not actually completely set by external market forces, but rather individual employers have some discretion on what wage they pay. And that, if you meet an ordinary person and ask them who set their wage, they say, well, my employer set my wage. They kind of know that. So the question is, how, when the employer sets your wage, do they set your wage with some discretion? Can they raise it 10% or lower it 10%, and you still likely to take the job or not? And in that second case where they have that power, it's, interestingly enough, the main implication of that's immediately testable is that if you force them to pay a slightly higher wage, they won't cut employment. And that's more or less what's going on right now in the US labor market. There's such good economic conditions in the labor market, and employers are all complaining that they can't hire any workers. And you say to yourself, well, if that's really true, and this, the standard commodity market model is true, why don't wages rise? And the answer is because employers are really thinking about that pretty carefully, and they say, well, I'd like to hire more workers, but if the next worker I hire, I'm going to have to pay a slightly higher wage to. And if I do that, I'll probably have to pay higher wages to all my other workers, and that's going to cost me a lot of money. So in that setting, employers are typically having vacancies open all the time, and willing to hire a new worker that comes along, but not necessarily to raise wages to increase employment. And if you force them to increase employment, then they will get that new worker, so they'll actually have higher employment, but they'll be worse off because they'll have had to pay more to previous workers. So workers will be better off and firms will be worse off. Anyway, that was the idea. And we always, everyone who's a labor economist had always found that idea compelling. But the sort of more theoretically oriented people, especially more classically or neoclassical people, more conservative type economists, didn't like that model because it has implications that, maybe the market isn't quite perfect. And that used to be quite an important discussion. It's not quite as important anymore. I don't think people kind of have finally realized, of course the market isn't perfect. But that doesn't mean that we're going to overturn the market economy and revert to hard enough communism or something. But for some reason, that was kind of how it was pitched, even to my generation of students. Either you had the perfect market or you had communism. It's kind of like a discussion in a bar in southern Italy in 1958. Like a Shasha novel, gone crazy. So anyway, that's how it was, and so we thought it would be really interesting to try and test that.
In Spain, the minimum wage is about to be introduced. The Minister of Labor and the unions have decided on a minimum wage of 1,000 euros, but the employers' organizations are against it. In Italy, we still do not have a minimum wage. Why do you think many countries still have great doubts about introducing a minimum wage?
Yeah, I think that's a serious question. So actually, a good example of that was about 8 years ago, Germany never had a minimum wage, and they introduced one. And it was under, Mrs. Merkel, who was fairly conservative. And so I know a couple of her advisors were completely, unhappy with that. They thought, why is she doing that? And there was a lot of predictions that it was going to be devastating, especially in East Germany and the parts of Germany, the rural parts closer to Poland's Polish border and so on, where times aren't that good, and even at €8 or €9 an hour job is a pretty good job. And it didn't seem to cause as much trouble as everyone predicted. And so that experience, I think, is something that if I was, thinking about other countries, I would keep in mind. Now, on the other hand, the wage that they set wasn't that high by German standards. German economy is pretty competitive, and so I think it's possible to. I think every economist would argue or agree that even if you have the story I mentioned before of like employers can set wages and they have some discretion, if you put the minimum wage too high, the story is different. Mm-hmm. And you could have consequences. So, the first thing I would say about it is somebody has to try and figure out like where is the right level of, if you're going to have a minimum wage. And it's a very complicated question in a lot of places. Like in Spain, for instance, 1,000 euros is probably not that much in Madrid or Barcelona. But it's probably a lot in other labor markets, and it might be more of a problem for employers one place than another. And we have exactly that problem in the United States. Difference in wages between where I live, which is one of the higher wage areas, and some of the low wage areas, it's almost 2 to 1 in average wages. And so that's a really difficult problem. And it kind of addresses a political economy problem, because someone would say, well, why should we have a minimum wage that's so, we can't, if we're going to have a minimum wage and it's a national minimum wage, it should be high enough for the country on average, and yet it might be problematic in some places. So we haven't really resolved that. So I think that question of whether there should be a national minimum wage probably is related to other situations. For instance, in Italy, I think a very large fraction, maybe 80-85% of workers have some kind of minimum for their wage because of the collective bargains that set these these bargains. Oftentimes it's multiple employers and a union. Sure. And they're covering all of the construction workers in a couple of provinces. They're often fairly low, and there's not a complete set of these wages, so there's some people that aren't covered and so on. I did a study of that kind of situation in Portugal recently, and we keep hoping that it'll be possible to do more of that kind of research in places like Italy. It's very difficult because the wage rates in those contracts it's very hard to collect them all. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard to merge them to an individual worker and say, okay, what exact is the minimum wage that's specified by your contract? Which category are you in? And so it's a huge amount of work to do that, even for a small country like Portugal. So for a bigger country like Italy, it would be a 5-year effort. Somebody would really have to really get focused on it. But I think I wouldn't be surprised if we'll see it in the next 10 years that people will start doing that. So there is this alternative minimum system in Italy that is also relevant. They have the same system in Spain, actually. Mm-hmm. So that's a bit of guarantee. There isn't such a thing as that in like the Anglo countries, because there isn't a universal coverage by collective bargaining. So that's a difference. And there isn't really in Germany either. So they have some union coverage in Germany, but union employers don't have to pay the union minimum wage.
If introducing or increasing the minimum wage does not affect employment demand, is it possible that it could affect consumer prices, causing them to rise?
Yes. Yes, it's quite possible. They could also affect lots of other dimensions. So for instance, if you, a lot of people that receive the minimum wage are people that work in shops, selling stuff. And so what you would expect is if the shop owners have to pay a higher wage, they're not going to be able to pay as higher rents. And so that's a very strong prediction of these class of models that you're going to have. They're going to have to try and save money elsewhere. And one really straightforward place is on the rents for small shops and shopping malls and things like that. So you would get some increase in prices, some downward pressure on rents. You're also going to get, reductions in the profitability of those companies probably. There was a nice study a couple of years ago by Stephen Machen at University College London, looking at what happened. The British government announced, kind of unexpectedly, the conservative British government announced a fairly big increase in the minimum wage, much bigger than the low wage commission had recommended. And so he went and studied what happened to the stock market prices of firms that mostly hire low wage workers, like Tesco and so on, and showed that that was a negative shock to the value of the business.
We have said that the introduction or increase of the minimum wage does not have a negative effect on employment and prices. I wonder if this statement is always true, or if there's a level beyond which the minimum wage becomes too high and, in a certain sense, dangerous.
Oh, absolutely, sure. I mean, it depends. So in a lot of places, if the minimum wage was too high, people wouldn't pay it. So that would be true. In all honesty, that would be true. I'm from Canada. Canada's a little bit more like the Italian model. So, if the law is too crazy, we kind of ignore it. So that I think there's always an out or an escape if people can figure out ways around completely crazy laws. But I think that those start to have effects too. Even if you're trying to do something to evade the law, you still have some effect. So absolutely, there's no question if you said that every job has to pay 2,500 euros, for instance, that would seem like a very, very serious problem for a lot of economies. And so you would expect, and it was rigorously enforced, you would expect, that would be devastating for employment for low-wage workers. So when someone says, the results of my study, my study was for the U.S. labor market. Wages for low-wage workers in the U.S. are quite low, as in some areas, at least in most areas of the country. And so, nowadays the minimum wage in my area is close to $15, but in lots of other parts of the U.S. it's only $7 per hour. So, that's a pretty low wage considering, the exchange rate and so on. So I think in those settings, it could be very different than, other settings where the proposed minimum wage is maybe affecting 25 or 30% of workers. Typically in the US, the minimum wage is only affecting 2 or 3 or 4% of workers.
In August 2010, Simon Bowmaker asked you if you had any professional ambitions, and you replied, "Retire as soon as possible. I don't want to be one of those guys who hangs on forever and everybody makes fun of." Well, 11 years later, you won a Nobel Prize. So, now I ask you if you still have other professional ambitions.
Well, I am retiring next year. Yeah, I had to wait until my wife was covered by the government insurance plan, so she's going to be 65. Yeah, so I've managed. I do think that there's that it is important. It's nice that you read Simon's interview. He's a very nice person. I do think it's important for academia that we, we need to have some change and innovation, and young people come in and find new things, and sometimes completely overturn the things that the older people did, and that's quite good, I think. And I don't think we want to discourage innovation, and it's going to be more and more of a problem in the whole world because there's fewer and fewer young people. So I think actually that's a major problem for a lot of Western economies going forward, is that we don't have enough young people, and things are I'm a bit concerned that they're going to become less innovative.